So on the surface, I can interpret that charitably and say, well, what I mean to say is that, look, I could be wrong. I recognize that insofar as I'm making a claim, there could be holes in my claims. There could be holes in my argument. There could be things that I'm overlooking. There could be biases that I'm not even aware of and that you could help me identify. That's a charitable read of it, and that certainly that's not only good, that's necessary in order to learn, right? Another word for that would be humble, right? Be humble. But being humble does not imply that you can't say what you think to be true, right? But you can. How can you not believe what you believe is true? Why else would you believe it? Seriously. Why else would you believe something if you don't believe it's true? So it's sort of disingenuous to say, I'm telling you this and I believe it, but I don't think it's true. Then the other person says, I'm talking with a madman. Literally, I'm talking with somebody who's telling me that what they believe is both true and not true at the same time in the same way. And so we should just clear the table here, recognize the necessity of intellectual humility, but also recognize the necessity of clarity, right? Of clarity. So, if you honestly believe that evil exists, then you must necessarily believe that good exists as well. Because the condition for the possibility of identifying something as evil is to have the possibility of defining something as not evil. Moral evil is easier from a theological perspective to explain, in the sense that, unlike natural evils, moral evil actually is always the consequence of human freedom, and therefore is not a natural feature of reality. There's nothing about moral evil that was intended to be here. It's all our invention. So here we're talking about the most terrible crimes that we can conceive of or that we've perhaps experienced in one way or another: rape, murder, theft, lying, infidelity, drug use, or not just the use of the drugs, but the actual creation, the people who are creating the drugs that are destroying societies, right, including our own, sexual abuse and the cover-up of sexual abuse. Right? These are all choices that human beings make both individually and in groups in ways that sort of mutually feed off of each other, and in doing so create not only pain and suffering, but actually create genuine evil in the world. So then the question becomes, well, we can say that God doesn't necessarily create that if we're the ones who are doing it, but why does God allow it? Why would God allow human beings to do that to each other if in fact God is all-knowing and all-powerful and all-loving, all good? Well, it actually comes back to God's love. And again, this sort of syllogism, this kind of argument may not be the most compelling to someone who's experiencing some devastation from some wickedness that someone has done them. But again, that doesn't mean it's not true. So basically, this is the logic here. If God seeks a relationship with us, God seeks to experience our love. God desires our love. So God loves us into being, but God creates us with the capacity to choose to love Him as well. So the condition for the possibility of that love, meaning the only thing that makes that love possible, is if we're free to love, right? Love is based upon, it doesn't make sense absent freedom. You can't take freedom out of love and still have love. You have compulsion, you have coercion, you have some sort of dependency, like an animal that loves his master because it gets a dog bone or something like that. That's not love. That's not love. It's actually just it's the flip side of fear, absolute dependency. If it's true love, it must be free. It must have some kind of independence from dependency itself. So there has to be genuine choice involved. So love implies freedom. But in order to have true freedom, freedom to love God, freedom to be good, that necessarily implies that we must also have the freedom to be bad, to do evil. We literally can't have one kind of freedom without having the other kind of freedom. Now, that doesn't mean that God has created us to misuse our freedom. God has created us as free, and as free, we have the freedom to employ that freedom to love or not to love. So to remove that freedom, to say, well, why doesn't God just cure all the evils of the world by prohibiting people, making it impossible for people to destroy each other, including people in the church? Why doesn't God just purify His church right now and just remove all of these wicked, lying, duplicitous, and abusive people in all these different positions? Just clean it out, God. The cost of that would be not to have a church. The cost of that would be not to be the mystical body of Christ, understood as human beings who are choosing to be a part of that mystical body. We literally can't have one without the other. So again, God permits this, and I'll say more about that in just a moment, precisely because God loves us. It's because God loves us that God allows evil to exist in the world. It's not in spite of it, it's because of it. God doesn't want evil. God doesn't will evil. God doesn't desire evil. God desires love. We desire evil. And until we choose not to engage in evil, it will exist. But that's on us and not on God. We also have some uniquely monotheistic and Christian replies to the problem of evil as well. So I've been talking more about sort of philosophical responses to the problem of evil. In addition to that, not in contradistinction, but in addition to that, we can also look within our own tradition for some additional arguments for why it doesn't make sense to blame God for evil. One is that we have to distinguish between what's called God's permissive will and God's active will. These are two different kinds of wills that we can attribute to God acting. To say that God has an active will means that God directly intends to act in a particular kind of way. So, for example, we as Catholics believe that God directly intended to become man, in a literal sense, in the person of Jesus Christ. It wasn't permitted to happen. God didn't permit him. You see how the language wouldn't even work there. God permitted himself to create himself. God intended and acted on that intention to become fully human in the person of Jesus Christ. God did not actively intend for his own crucifixion. Right? God allowed himself to be tortured and destroyed by the human beings whom he came to save. He didn't intend for the actual crucifixion itself. So God allows for evil in that particular kind of way. God doesn't intend evil. God doesn't create evil. God allows it. So anytime we're talking about God and God in relationship to the world, or God in relationship to our own lives, or to whatever group we're examining, we have to ask ourselves, do we mean God's active will, I mean what God is directly doing, or God's permissive will in what God is allowing to happen? Because certainly nothing happens outside of God, as it were, right? There's no inch of the universe that God does not have providence over. But within that providence, we see direct action and the allowance for action that is not intended by God, but allowed by God. And a lot of the distinctions of why this particular evil is happening can be cleared up just by looking at that particular distinction right there. We also can recognize that God does providentially bring good out of evil, meaning that God takes what human beings give him. And that's the thing about freedom, right? Is God responds to us. That doesn't make God less God. It makes God a loving God. God responds to our response to God. And so we can give God hatred and abuse and wickedness and lies, and God can, in and through God's providence, weave that into some kind of beautiful conversion story, for example. In fact, a conversion story that wouldn't have happened were it not for this terrible event. And perhaps, maybe even likely, you have some kind of story along those lines yourself at some point in your life, or maybe at several points in your life, where some terrible thing has happened in one way or another. And years later you realize, had it not been for that terrible thing happening, that at the time was genuinely terrible, and I didn't seek it out, I would not be here where I am right now, with these kinds of thoughts and this kind of motivation in my heart. And so you see there how God is weaving together this tapestry of beauty out of the garbage that we oftentimes or frequently give him, right? And there we have scriptural basis for that. St. Paul saying, for example, in Romans, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. So that's one of the beauties of our faith, of many beauties, is that when we truly do trust in God, not just abstract God, but God as the risen Christ, crucified and risen Christ, we do see dimly, but with confidence, that God is with us along the ways. And there's a cheesy old country song used to go, "Thank God for all the prayers you didn't answer." Well, there's something to that, right? It's that our will sometimes, if we were to get what we want, that would be the most terrible thing for us. And we don't realize it until a long time after. But we do realize it as long as we're steadfast and faithful. We also have to keep in mind here that there's no centimeter of suffering. There's no speck of suffering that God himself has not experienced in the flesh, as it were. And it's a distinctively Christian conception. You're not going to find that in just the Yahweh of the Hebrew tradition, or you're not going to find that in Allah, right? You're actually going to find in Christianity a specific claim that God has, as it were, eaten up the suffering of the world by experiencing both natural evil. Think of Jesus being tempted in the desert for 40 days. It's hot in the desert, right? He experienced the pain of creation itself, and hunger, the absence of food, the absence of sustenance, and moral evil when he was crucified, right? So through the whole life of Jesus, while he's with us in the flesh, gobbles up all of that evil into itself. And so no Catholic can claim, I'm experiencing something that God has never experienced. Think of Jesus going down to the very depths of desolation when he says on the cross, "Why have you abandoned me?" I mean, he actually enters into the death. He actually, not only physical death, he enters into spiritual death to gobble that up too. And so again, whatever suffering we're experiencing, we have to see it in light of the crucified Christ and know that the flip side of the crucified Christ is the resurrection, and also to know that you don't get the resurrection without the crucifixion. And so we weave ourselves to that narrative as we move forward.
Do you want to fall in love with God? I'm sure we all want to. The book of Psalms contains the directions. Thousands of years ago, people like you and me talked to God out of the depths of their hearts, revealing an intimate love. Psalms are the expression of the faith in God by people around 3,000 years ago. God was not a mere abstract creator, but was present, involved, and a real person of power and emotions. Now, when we read or listen to the Psalms, we can know the intensity of this love. Entering into the influence of the Psalms, we can find a path to know and love God. To know more about the Psalms, you should get a copy of Father Mike Manning's booklet, The Psalms. It will help you to understand the 150 Psalms better as he has categorized them. He uses the technique of acts: adoration, contrition, thanksgiving, and supplication. Get your copy today and know the categories. Learn to pray with the Psalms.
Call the number on the screen or email us. You can also get it through our website. Get your copy today.
A warning, though, and this is especially a warning against the prosperity gospel, which is prominent in a lot of so-called mega churches now. So it's true that God is always with those who invite him to be part of their lives. It's true. And think of the last words of the gospel, Matthew, "I will always be with you until the end of the age." So we know that. We know that God is always with us. But we have to be careful how we interpret the circumstances in our life as evidence of either favor or disfavor with God. This is particularly Christian, right? When we look at the Old Testament, there does appear to be a pretty definitive connection between being faithful to Yahweh and good times, that is reinterpreted at the very least in the New Testament, so that good times may or may not directly correspond with you being in right relationship with God. So here, the words of Luke, of Jesus in Luke, the Beatitudes, of where he moves from the blessings to the woes, should constantly be echoing in our minds. But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when everyone speaks well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets. So Jesus Christ gives us a distinct warning, not to say that we should expect misery and pain our whole lives, but to be careful that we don't, and this is at the heart of the sin of idolatry and pride. You say, well, I just got a new job. Jesus loves me especially right now. Or I just got a raise. I must be a really good person. Maybe, maybe not. The flip side of that is, I'm going through some terrible darkness right now. God, therefore, must hate me. It could actually be the opposite, that God is actually permitting, not intending, but permitting this kind of darkness in your own life because of the great love that he has for you and the transformation that awaits you if you're willing to walk with him to the other side. So it's a warning. It doesn't define anything definitively or tell us that we all have to move out into the desert and walk around, eating locusts. I don't know if there's locusts in the California deserts, but it's not that. It's not meant to be interpreted in that specific literal sense, but it is a warning. It's a real warning about the well-being of our souls. So that's objection number one and the response to objection number one. Objection number two, you cannot believe in God if you believe in free will. So here's the argument. If God exists, there is no free will, but there is free will. Therefore, God does not exist. So again, it has this kind of a catchy logic to it, right? Well, but there is free will, and if you say God and free will can't exist, well, I guess God doesn't exist, right? There's some responses to that. But before we get to those responses, here's two forms that logical argument usually takes in just a more conversational sense. On the one hand, you'll hear people frequently say, well, if God exists, he knows everything that you're going to do. And if he knows everything that you're going to do, therefore, you're not free because whatever you do, he knows you're going to do it. Or if you're not going to do it, or if you're thinking about you're going to do it, but then you don't do it, but then you do half of it, and then you try to not do it. It's like God knows, God knows. God's always a step ahead of you. So because of that, because of God's omniscience, you aren't free. That's one version of this. The other is that if God exists, you don't have free choice on how to define happiness or how to live your life. Or one way I've heard it put many times is you have someone up in the sky telling you what to do. Like some mean tyrant in the clouds dictating to you what your life should be, and therefore you don't actually have free will. Well, let's take those two apart. Okay, so first we have to recognize that God is indeed all-knowing. That's a necessary feature of defining God as God. So that's on the table. We're not going to take that off on the table. But this is where the equivocation comes in. Knowing something does not mean causing something. Those are two different verbs, right? I've never understood why they're put together in this, as if they mean the same thing. Think of all the things that you know right now, but you're not causing. Do you know the sun will rise tomorrow? Therefore, you're causing the sun to rise, right? Do you know your friends' names? Therefore, you gave them their names. Do you know that your children are lying to you? Therefore, you're causing them to lie to you. Do you see how it doesn't quite work, right? We don't apply that logic to any other experience in our life, but somehow we're going to create this huge logical gap and attribute it to God. It doesn't make sense to say that God knows something, and therefore, because God knows it, God causes it. Right? It just in a logical sense, it doesn't make sense. Now, we could still say, but what about the fact that God does know, that God knows whether right now, God knows whether I'm going to go to hell or heaven or purgatory. God knows. You know who doesn't know? I don't know. I don't know. So, I mean, I can hope. I can certainly hope. I can trust, but I don't know. So it's actually, in terms of the freedom of my will, it makes no difference to me from a subjective perspective whether God knows or doesn't know. God does know, but I don't. And so I'm still responsible for the content of my choices and the person whom I choose to be. So again, just at the experiential or the psychological level, it doesn't matter that God knows what you're going to do. So what is fixed, what is permanent, and we don't have any freedom with regards to, is the invitation to be in a relationship with God. That's there. What's not fixed is our choice to accept it or not to accept it. That story we write. God doesn't write that story. We write it individually and in community. Another example just along these same lines is to say, well, look, God knows that evil exists. Of course God knows that evil exists. As we just talked about the crucifixion. But saying that God knows it, even that God experiences it, doesn't mean that God causes it. You see, it just doesn't follow either logically or scripturally. Well, how about this idea that God imposes rules on us and that those rules are somehow an obstacle to free will? Well, again, it's true that living in relation to God, it does create responsibility to a reality that precedes us. And I wrote responsibility really big here. Think of the root word of the word responsibility, response. What it is to respond to something is to acknowledge it's there. So it's not something I've created. It's intimately related to me, but it's not mine in a sense. I recognize it as being there and recognize it having a claim over me. So I respond to it, right? And so if God does exist, I must respond to the reality of God existing and who God is. But then we have to say, well, look, does rejecting God to saying, well, but I don't believe in God. If I say I don't believe in God or God doesn't exist, am I now free from responsibility? Because that would be the goal of this critique, right? To say, well, I'm going to liberate you from all responsibility by saying that God exists. Well, is that true? Does it actually follow? Okay, so apart from God, responsibility can be grounded in two sources. Either nature and or reason, like a natural law. We touched on these in previous lectures, or reason itself, but with no God attached. Or to the human will itself, either your will or someone else's will or the will of a corporate body or something like that. Okay, so let's look at the first one, nature and reason. Option A, if you're saying, well, look, there's no God, but there still is like a natural law or there still is some kind of moral law that comes from our reason, you know what you're still saying exists? Responsibility. You're still responding to something external to you, as it were. You're just not calling it God. So if your goal was to get into a condition in which you no longer have to be responsible to anything, option A is not going to cut it for you. It's just the same problem. You've just removed God from it. So that's cheating. You can't say, well, you're going to be free, but we're still going to say that there's these real objective rules right there, and now you're liberated. And you haven't been liberated. You've just been shifted. You've been shifted into a different category, but you're still responsible to something outside of you. So that one, option A doesn't work. Option B, the human will. Okay. Now, it could be true, in some sense, I suppose, that if you get to create your own rules utterly, then you'll be free from responsibility. But that doesn't mean that you're free. So first and foremost, if I say there's no such thing as any kind of morality or any kind of objective standard, either God-derived or not God-derived, and so human beings come up with the rules, as it were, well, it's very likely I'm still going to find myself responsible just to someone else's arbitrary will, like some tyrant, or the person who has the most guns, or the person who was able to trick enough people into following him or her. So I'm still going to be responding to something, just responding to something arbitrary. Well, that's a nightmare. That's why Pope Benedict called relativism a dictatorship of relativism. Why? Because if there's no truth, and it is just the human will that creates the rules, well, then all that is power. We've come back to this many times. And so, yes, you're still responding to something, but now you're responding to just a sheer whim of someone. And think of like Kim Jong-il in North Korea, or Saddam Hussein, or all the other tyrants that have littered human history, right? Is that what you want? Welcome to your liberation, right? Okay, that's one possibility. But let's say you get lucky, and you happen to be on an island by yourself or with just a few other people, and none of them appear to be disposed to be a tyrant, at least not right now. Now maybe you can say you're free. You're not responsible to anyone. Well, then the question becomes, well, how should I live my life? And if there's no objective standard, if there's no real rule, and you invent the rules, that sounds great, right? Well, I invent the rules. I'm king. Okay, so how should I govern? Well, consult yourself. Okay, I don't know what I want, right? I actually want 25 different things at the same time. So which one should I act on? Which impulse that's driving me right now? or the dozens of impulses that are pushing me in different directions, which one should I follow and say, that take me in that direction, will? And then the answer is ask yourself. And then you say, I did ask myself and I don't know. Ask yourself again. I did. I'm looking for an answer here. And what you find is you're just going to get into your, this is a deep philosophical insight that goes, again, all the way back to Socrates. You become a slave to your own desires. You actually have no direction to tell yourself of how to live your life, because all of us are a mixed bag stew, I use the metaphor stew there, of conflicting desires. And if we have no standard to say, this one, not this one, or this one in this situation, this one, this situation, then we literally become slaves to ourselves. We are not free to act in the way that we want to act because we don't even know how we want to act at any given time. So, in short, total freedom, it's impossible in a sense. We can't be totally free. It's delusional to think that. And it's also a nightmare. So the question isn't whether responsibility or not. It's not that you're going to say, well, I'm going to be in this camp and it's this, I'm going to say yes to responsibility, and those people say no. It's not whether, it's which responsibility do you choose? Because all of us have to be responsible to someone or something. Atheism, instead of liberating the human will, it's actually the death of free will. It's the death of free will. Why? So, if God does not exist, and that's what atheism is claiming, existence by definition is accidental and arbitrary. And all that exists is matter, stuff. That's it. It's just stuff. So any choice that we make, any kind of love you experience or any sense of responsibility or purpose, it's all an illusion. So if that's all an illusion, you know what else is an illusion? Freedom is an illusion. You can't destroy everything and say, but I take this one back, right? It doesn't make sense. You can't say that everything is arbitrary except for freedom. And then what human freedom properly understood is the free choice to act in accordance with reality itself, and that's entirely up to us in one way or another, or to act against reality itself. So we're not saying that we're totally free, but we're saying we're actually free. And we can say that we're actually free only because freedom exists because God has created it. So free will is actually a gift of theism or belief in God, not of atheism. But wait a minute. If there's no God, then there's no truth except for the truth that there is no truth, which literally means that any other thing that you could possibly say in any sphere of life, whether political or religious or social, is moot. In other words, you're the most closed-minded person ever if you are sincerely following the logic of your own position. There's nothing left to discover if there is no God, because all conclusions lead back to that one nullity.